It had been 2 days since Hurricane Harvey tore through Sinton, Texas, leaving the town in ruins. The storm's fury had passed, but the damage was still clear: flooded streets, uprooted trees, and homes shattered by the winds. Sarah Miller stood on her front porch, staring at the destruction that surrounded her. She had moved to this small town only 2 months ago, seeking a fresh start after the loss of her husband. But now, she found herself stranded in a place where everything felt foreign and empty, the silence only broken by the distant hum of generators and the rustling of debris. The sky, once dark and menacing, had cleared, and the sun was finally peeking through the clouds. But there was a chill in the air, unusual for late August. It felt like the hurricane had taken summer with it, leaving behind a cool emptiness. Sarah hugged her cardigan tighter around her, trying to ward off the creeping cold. Her phone lay on the table next to her, the screen dark. No calls, no messages. She hadn't heard from her family in days. She was alone, and for the first time in a long while, she truly felt the weight of it. Just as Sarah was about to retreat inside, something caught her eye. A flicker of movement down the waterlogged street. She squinted, unsure if she was imagining things, but there it was, a dog, walking steadily toward her, dragging something heavy behind it. The dog was a border collie, but its coat, usually sleek and shiny, was now matted and dirty. Its fur was caked with mud, its body thin and tired looking. The dog's gait was slow but deliberate, as though it had somewhere to go. Sarah watched it with a mix of curiosity and concern. What was this dog doing here, after the storm? The dog's pace faltered as it dragged the heavy burlap sack behind it, its paws slipping in the wet debris. It was clear that the sack was too heavy for the dog, yet it persisted, stopping every few steps to adjust its grip. There was something in the dog's eyes, though, something determined and resolute. This was no stray wandering aimlessly. The dog had a mission. Instinctively, Sarah stepped off the porch and began to follow at a distance. She didn't know why she felt compelled to follow this dog, but there was something about it that seemed important. The dog didn't look back at her, focused on its journey as it carefully made its way down the street. Sarah's heart beat a little faster as she followed the dog. As it passed by the wreckage of homes, she noticed that the few people still out in the neighborhood didn't seem alarmed by the dog's presence. They either watched it with curiosity or paid it no mind at all. Finally, after what felt like a long journey, the dog reached the end of the block. It stopped in front of an old, run-down ranch house, where it paused for a moment before dropping the sack onto the stoop. Then, as if its job was done, the dog sat back on its haunches and made a sound, something between a whine and a chirp, almost like it was signaling someone inside. Sarah, now standing at the edge of the yard, wasn't sure what to do. She had followed the dog this far, but something about this moment felt sacred, almost as if she were witnessing an unspoken bond between the dog and this house. A door creaked open, and an elderly man appeared. He seemed surprised to see the dog, but there was a warmth in his eyes as he looked down at it. With a chuckle, he bent down and picked up the burlap sack. "Well, looks like you made it through, Rusty," he said, as if talking to an old friend. The dog's name was Rusty. And in that moment, Sarah realized that this wasn't just a stray dog, this was a companion, a protector, and it had a purpose. She stood frozen, feeling the weight of the moment, unsure if she should intrude on this quiet exchange. But the elderly man noticed her then, and with a smile, he waved her forward. "Looks like Rusty brought me some supplies. I've got a feeling you might have some questions." Sarah stood at the edge of the yard, unsure of what to do next. The elderly man had called out to her, inviting her closer, but there was something delicate about the moment, something that made her hesitate. The dog, Rusty, looked up at her with eyes that seemed to say, "It's okay to approach." So, with cautious steps, Sarah moved toward the man and the dog. As she neared, she noticed just how ragged the dog looked. Rusty's fur, once sleek and vibrant, was now tangled and matted, drenched in mud from the storm. He had clearly been through a lot. Despite his tired appearance, there was a certain pride in the way he carried himself, his head held high, his eyes sharp, always alert. The man, George, smiled as she got closer, his gaze lingering on Rusty with affection. "I'm George Parker," he said warmly, extending a hand to Sarah. "And this here's Rusty." "Sarah Miller," she replied, shaking his hand. "I live a few blocks over." She glanced at the burlap sack that Rusty had dropped at George's feet. "What's in the bag?" Sarah asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. George chuckled softly. "That's the real question, isn't it? Rusty's got a way of finding what's important, even when you least expect it." He bent down to open the bag, and Sarah leaned in closer, eager to see what the dog had brought. Inside the bag were cans of food, bottled water, and, strangely enough, some pet kibble. The sight made Sarah's heart skip a beat. It was clear that Rusty had made a long journey, braving the storm's aftermath to bring George something vital. The old man seemed both grateful and amazed by Rusty's actions. "I guess he didn't want me to go hungry," George said with a soft laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at Sarah, his expression growing more serious. "He's done this before. Brought me things when I needed them most. I don't know how he knows, but he always does." Rusty sat next to George, his tail wagging slightly as if proud of his contribution. It was clear that this wasn't just a random act, there was a bond between the two, one that went beyond simple companionship. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the dog. Rusty wasn't just a survivor of the storm, he was a guardian, a helper, someone who could sense what was needed before anyone else. As George continued to sort through the supplies, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had driven the dog to act this way, to be so attuned to the needs of the people around him. George looked up from the bag, his weathered hands gently sorting through the supplies. He seemed almost overwhelmed, as if he couldn't quite believe what Rusty had done. The old man wiped his brow, then gave Rusty a gentle pat on the head, his voice thick with emotion. "You always know what to do, don't you, boy?" George murmured, his tone filled with both gratitude and wonder. Sarah couldn't help but smile, feeling warmth spread through her chest. There was something special about this dog, something that went beyond simple loyalty. She moved closer, feeling more at ease now that she could see how calm and comfortable Rusty was with the old man. "How long have you had him?" Sarah asked softly, not wanting to disturb the peace that had settled over the small yard. George straightened up, his expression thoughtful. "Rusty's been with me for about 8 years now. Found him as a pup on the side of the road. Scrawny little thing, looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Took him in thinking I'd just nurse him back to health and find him a home. But, well, guess we found a home together." Sarah chuckled lightly. "Seems like he's more than just a pet to you." George nodded, his eyes glistening with unspoken memories. "That he is. We've been through a lot, me and Rusty. My wife passed not long after I found him. He stuck by me, kept me company through those lonely nights. Guess I needed him more than he needed me." The old man glanced down at Rusty, who lay contentedly at his feet, his matted fur still damp from his journey. "When the hurricane warnings came, I didn't have the heart to leave him behind. My son begged me to evacuate with him and the family, but I stayed. Couldn't bear to abandon my old friend. I thought we'd just ride out the storm together." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, touched by George's quiet resolve. "You really risked staying just for him?" George looked at her with a faint smile. "A man can't just abandon his best friend. Rusty's been by my side through every storm life's thrown at us, literal or not. Didn't seem right to leave him now." Sarah looked at the tired, noble dog, and it hit her just how deep that bond went. Rusty wasn't just a dog. He was family. In that moment, she understood the quiet strength that had kept both man and dog fighting to survive, and how love, in its simplest form, could mean holding on when the world demanded you let go. As Rusty finally lay down, his eyes closing, George gave a gentle chuckle. "You've done enough for today, boy. Rest now. You've earned it." And as the sun dipped lower, Sarah felt an odd sense of peace herself, realizing that sometimes it wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about having someone by your side to face it with you. Sarah sat down on the weathered wooden porch, feeling the quiet pull of the conversation. She looked at Rusty, now lying contentedly beside George, his eyes half closed in relaxation. As George settled into his chair, his gaze shifted to the dog, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You know," George began, his voice steady but filled with fondness, "I never planned on keeping Rusty. I found him all those years ago when I was out in the woods, checking the property after a bad storm. He was just a little thing, barely a few weeks old, trapped in some debris. His mother was nowhere to be found." George paused, his mind obviously drifting back in time. "I thought about taking him to the wildlife center, you know, doing the responsible thing. But there was something about him. He was so small, so vulnerable, and something in me just couldn't leave him behind." Sarah leaned forward, drawn in by the tenderness in George's voice. "I took him home, fed him with a bottle, kept him in the garage until he was strong enough to move around. For a while, I thought I'd release him once he got big enough. Let him return to the wild, like he was meant to." George shook his head slightly, the memory of his younger self now a soft laugh escaping his lips. But by then, it was clear Rusty had no intention of going anywhere. Sarah smiled, thinking of the stubbornness she could see in Rusty now. "What do you mean?" "Well," George continued, "when he started to walk around, he didn't act like a wild animal. He acted like he belonged. He would follow me around, and I mean everywhere. He'd sit on the porch watching the sunset with me. When I started doing my farm work, he was right by my side, always watching, always alert, as if he were learning how to help. And that's when I knew, I couldn't just let him go." There was a quiet pride in George's voice as he continued. "Rusty began following me like he had some kind of mission. He learned how to herd the sheep, how to help around the farm, even without any formal training. And when my wife, Sarah, passed, well, that's when it really hit me. Rusty became more than just a dog. He became my reason to get up in the morning. He helped fill the silence that had once felt like it might swallow me whole." George's eyes softened as he looked down at the dog, who was now gently snoring beside him. "There were days I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror, Sarah, but Rusty never cared. He never judged. He just loved. He stayed with me, every step of the way." Sarah was quiet for a moment, moved by the depth of George's words. She realized that Rusty was more than a pet to him, he was a companion, a constant source of strength, and, in many ways, a lifeline. "That's why I stayed through the storm, you know," George added, his voice a little quieter now. "Rusty and we've been through everything together. He's been there when no one else could be. And I wasn't about to leave him." As George sat back in his chair, the soft creaking of the wood filling the silence, his eyes never left Rusty, who was now stretched out lazily on the porch. There was a deep, almost reverent quality to his gaze, as if the memories of the past were both painful and beautiful at once. "The storm came at us fast," George continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of an old wound. "One minute, the skies were clear, and the next, it was a monster. The winds picked up so fast, I didn't have time to prepare, let alone leave. My son and his family, they begged me to evacuate with them, but I couldn't go. Rusty and we've been through too much together. I didn't want to leave him behind." Sarah sat silently, listening, her heart heavy with the understanding of how deep the bond between man and dog truly went. She could sense George's pain, the fear of losing something, or someone, that had been there through every difficult moment in his life. "The hurricane hit us like a freight train," George continued. "Roof tore off, windows shattered. Rusty bolted right out of the house through a broken window, scared out of his mind. He wasn't acting like himself. I thought I'd lost him for good." George paused, his fingers nervously tracing the armrest of his chair. "I didn't see him again for days. I stayed here, waiting, hoping he'd come back, but the storm just kept tearing through. The place looked like it had been ravaged by a giant, and I couldn't move, too many trees down, too much debris. I figured Rusty had run off and couldn't find his way back." The emotional weight of George's words seemed to hang in the air as the silence stretched. Sarah, unable to hold back her curiosity any longer, spoke softly. "So how did he come back?" George smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "He came back with a mission. A day or two after the worst of the storm passed, I was sitting here on the porch, just staring at the wreckage, when I saw him. Rusty, dragging something behind him. A burlap sack. It was heavy for him, and he was struggling, but he wasn't stopping. He came right up to me, dropped the sack at my feet, and looked at me like he knew exactly what I needed." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't imagine how George must have felt in that moment: relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of awe. "I couldn't believe it," George whispered. "Inside that bag were cans of food, bottled water, and even some pet kibble. It was like he knew exactly what I needed. I don't know how he did it. I don't know where he went or who helped him, but Rusty came back after everything, bringing me the supplies I couldn't get on my own." The dog lay still beside George, but there was something about him that made Sarah see him differently now, not just as a pet, but as a silent, loyal guardian. Rusty had given everything. He had risked his own safety to make sure George wasn't left alone, abandoned in the aftermath of the storm. And, for George, that was more than just loyalty, it was an act of pure love. Sarah sat quietly, her gaze drifting from Rusty to George, and back to the dog. Her heart was heavy, not just from hearing the story of Rusty's bravery, but because something in her had shifted. She had come to Sinton to escape, to find peace after years of emotional turmoil. But now, listening to George speak, Sarah realized how disconnected she had truly been, even in her attempt to heal. Rusty wasn't just a dog, he was a symbol of loyalty, of unconditional love, of a strength that seemed to pull people together, even when everything around them was falling apart. She looked at the dog, his tired eyes now gently closed as he rested peacefully beside George. He had given everything during the storm, risked his own life to ensure that George wouldn't be left to face the aftermath alone. For a brief moment, Sarah wondered if she, too, could be as brave, as loyal as Rusty had been. Could she learn to trust again? Could she allow herself to let go of the loneliness that had followed her since her husband passed away? "I'm not sure I could have made it without him," George said softly, breaking her reverie. Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time since she arrived in Sinton, she didn't feel quite so alone. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between her and George now, something that transcended words. In that moment, Sarah knew she had to make a choice. She could keep running from her pain, keeping herself distant from others, or she could begin to trust again, just as George trusted Rusty, and just as Rusty had trusted him. It was the hardest choice she'd ever have to make, but she could feel a small flicker of hope begin to stir inside her. The afternoon was beginning to fade, and the quiet calm that had settled over the town of Sinton felt surreal, almost like a dream. Sarah sat beside George on his porch, the two of them sharing a warm silence, broken only by the occasional sound of birds chirping or the distant hum of a generator. Rusty lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes closed as if he, too, was savoring the rare peace after the storm. But just as Sarah began to feel the weight of the past few days lift from her shoulders, the tranquility was shattered. Rusty suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching in the air as though hearing something distant and urgent. His body tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring, and his tail stiffened. For a moment, Sarah could only watch in confusion as the dog stared into the distance, his attention fixed on something far beyond the yard. "What's wrong, Rusty?" George asked, but the dog didn't respond. Instead, he leapt to his feet and began pacing in tight circles, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a focused intensity Sarah had never seen before. Then, without warning, Rusty shot off the porch, bounding toward the edge of the property where a large oak tree had fallen during the storm. George shot to his feet, calling out to the dog, but Rusty didn't stop. He continued running, his paws digging into the muddy ground, eyes locked on whatever had caught his attention. "Rusty! Wait!" George shouted, but it was no use. The dog was already too far ahead. Sarah stood up quickly, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. She followed George as he hurried toward the yard, both of them struggling to keep up with Rusty's determined pace. The dog was moving with a purpose, not the playful gait Sarah had seen earlier, but a serious, urgent stride. She could feel the tension building as the dog neared the fallen tree, the same place where a large section of debris had piled up after the hurricane. Then, from behind the tree, Sarah heard it, a low, guttural groan. Her heart skipped a beat. Was someone trapped? "George, is someone there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. George didn't answer, his face had gone pale as he sprinted forward. Rusty, now at the tree, stopped abruptly, his body tense as he stood guard, his eyes locked on the pile of wreckage. Sarah's stomach tightened with fear. She had a sickening feeling that something was terribly wrong. Without warning, Rusty moved again, darting through the debris like a shadow. He was quick, his movements fluid and sure, as though he had done this countless times before. Sarah watched in disbelief as Rusty nudged aside a large chunk of wood with his nose, revealing a figure beneath. The figure was a man, someone Sarah hadn't seen before. His clothes were torn, his face pale and covered in dirt. He groaned softly, barely able to move, his body pinned under the weight of the debris. The man's eyes were glazed with exhaustion and pain, but there was a flicker of recognition when he saw Rusty standing over him. Rusty didn't hesitate. He placed his front paws on the man's chest, pushing him gently as if trying to lift him. Then, he let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with urgency. It was as though the dog understood the situation far better than anyone else. George was the first to reach them, kneeling beside the man. "It's Frank," he muttered, recognizing the neighbor who lived 2 streets over. He must have been caught in the storm. Without missing a beat, George began to lift the debris off Frank's body, working quickly but carefully. Sarah joined him, helping to move the large chunks of wood and rubble away. Rusty, ever the loyal companion, stayed close, his eyes never leaving Frank. He seemed to sense that this was the moment when his actions could make the difference between life and death. As they finally freed Frank from the wreckage, he coughed weakly, his eyes fluttering open. "I thought I was going to die," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't get out, thought I was trapped for good." "Not with Rusty here," George said, his voice full of quiet pride. "He's always looking out for us." Frank nodded slowly, his body shaking from the shock of the experience. "I never would have made it out without him," he muttered, looking down at the dog, who now stood at attention, his tail wagging faintly. Sarah stood there, still in disbelief. She had watched as Rusty, the loyal dog, had not only saved George through the storm but had now saved a life in the aftermath. It was as if the dog had an instinct for knowing when to act, when someone needed help, when their world was about to shatter, and when they could still be saved. In that moment, Sarah realized that Rusty wasn't just a dog. He was something more, a silent protector, a guardian spirit, always watching over the people he loved. And as the sun began to set, casting an amber glow over the wreckage, Sarah knew she would never look at this dog the same way again. As the sun began to set behind the storm-ravaged homes, casting long shadows over the quiet street, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of George's porch, her thoughts swirling. The day had been filled with chaos, but also with a deep, unexpected sense of peace. Frank, now recovering inside George's house, had been shaken but grateful. He had no idea how Rusty had found him, how the dog had known exactly where to go in the midst of the destruction. But Sarah understood. There was something in Rusty's eyes, something unspoken, that told her this wasn't just coincidence. The bond between man and dog went beyond what she had ever realized. Rusty was more than a pet, he was a lifeline, a silent guardian who seemed to instinctively know when someone was in need. As Sarah gazed at the horizon, her mind wandered back to the time before the storm, when she had arrived in Sinton, feeling completely alone. She had kept to herself, locked in the quiet isolation that grief often brings. She hadn't expected to find a connection in a town so new, so foreign to her. But now, standing on this porch, watching the soft evening light bathe the town in a warm, golden hue, she realized something. The storm had torn apart so much of the world she knew, but it had also opened up the possibility of new beginnings. Rusty's presence had been the catalyst, guiding her towards something greater than just survival. He had brought George back to life in more ways than one, kept him grounded, and reminded him of the importance of loyalty, love, and community. And in doing so, Rusty had unknowingly taught Sarah a lesson about healing. She glanced at George, who was sitting in his chair, his hands resting on his knees as he looked out at the yard. Rusty, ever loyal, lay at his feet, content after a long day of unexpected heroics. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that life, though unpredictable, still held moments of beauty. "I guess I owe Rusty more than I can ever say," George said suddenly, breaking Sarah from her thoughts. He looked down at the dog, his voice soft but full of emotion. "He's always been my rock. Always knew when I needed him most." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "He's incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. George nodded. "He's not just a dog. He's family." In that moment, Sarah realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. Maybe she, too, could find a new family in Sinton, not just the people she had met, but the community she had yet to truly embrace. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from her pain and start opening herself up to the possibility of belonging. Rusty had brought George back to life after the storm, but perhaps he was also helping Sarah heal. She hadn't expected it, but in some strange way, this loyal dog had become a guide, leading her through the storm of her own emotions and helping her find a place to stand firm once again. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to twinkle above, Sarah felt a quiet hope stir inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. And perhaps, in time, she would learn to trust again. Rusty, the dog who had braved the storm and brought George and the community together, had shown her that even in the darkest moments, there was always room for a second chance. With a final look at the dog curled up at George's feet, Sarah knew she would always remember this day, the day the storm passed and the healing began. The story of Rusty, George's loyal companion, teaches us a profound lesson about loyalty, sacrifice, and the power of friendship. Rusty is not just a dog, he is a protector, a source of hope, and a companion who helps people through their darkest times. Through Rusty's actions, we learn that in moments of despair, love and loyalty can be invaluable sources of strength. The important message is that sometimes, we don't have to face challenges alone. Genuine relationships, whether with humans or animals, can help us find peace and hope again. We should open our hearts to the connections around us, as they may bring miracles we never expected.